The surprise that changed everything. Sophie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the delicate strap of her red dress. The silky fabric clung to her curves in all the right places, its deep crimson shade glowing in the warm candlelight. She smoothed her hands down the fabric, taking a deep breath. Tonight had to be perfect. She had spent all day preparing for this. Their night. She had cooked Ethan's favorite meal from scratch, set up their bedroom with soft candles and scattered rose petals, and even picked out the perfume he once told her made his heart race. It had been too long since they had a night like this. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when things had started to change between them. Maybe it had been gradual, the slow unraveling of warmth replaced by the chill of routine. Or maybe it had been sudden, like a snapped thread she hadn't noticed until the fabric of their relationship had started to fray. At first, it was little things. He started coming home later, offering vague excuses about work. His phone became something he guarded carefully, always turned face down on the table, silenced during dinner. He had stopped reaching for her in bed, the space between them growing wider with each passing night. She had convinced herself that it was just stress, that it was temporary. But deep down, a nagging fear had settled in her chest like a heavy stone. What if something was wrong? What if he wasn't happy anymore? No, she shook the thought from her mind, forcing herself to smile. That's why tonight was so important. To remind him of what they had, to bring back the closeness that had once come so effortlessly. She took one last look at herself in the mirror, adjusting a loose strand of hair before stepping toward the door. Then a thought struck her. What if I surprise him? A playful smile curled at her lips. It had been so long since they'd done anything spontaneous. She imagined the look on his face when he walked into the bedroom, expecting a normal night, only to have her jump out and wrap her arms around him. It would be fun. A way to break the ice. With her heart pounding with excitement, she quickly slipped into the walk-in closet, pressing herself between Ethan's neatly hung shirts. The scent of his cologne clung to the fabric, familiar and comforting. She could hear the faint tick of the clock in the bedroom, the soft flicker of candle flames casting shadows against the walls. Then, the front door opened. Her pulse quickened. She heard the familiar rustling of Ethan setting down his keys, the creak of his shoes against the wooden floor. But then, instead of calling out her name like he always did, there was silence. And then, a low murmur. He was on the phone. Sophie smiled to herself, pressing a hand to her mouth to keep from laughing. Maybe she could time it just right, wait for him to finish his call, then jump out and catch him off guard. But as she listened, her smile faded. Something about his voice was off. It wasn't his usual tired tone. It was tense, almost nervous. I know, Ethan muttered. I know, okay. But she doesn't suspect anything. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Her mind spun. Was he talking about her? I've handled it so far, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't keep lying to her forever. The room suddenly felt suffocating. Lying? Her heart hammered against her ribs, her fingers digging into the soft fabric of his hanging shirts. She trusts me, he said, and I don't want to ruin that. But if she ever finds out the truth. He trailed off, and for a moment, there was only silence. Sophie's knees felt weak. The truth about what? Her thoughts spiraled. Was he cheating on her? It was the first explanation that came to mind. The late nights, the guarded phone, the way he had slowly been pulling away. But if that were the case, why did he sound so afraid? She pressed herself deeper into the closet, hardly daring to breathe. Then, his next words made her stomach drop. No, we stick to the plan, Ethan said firmly. I'll take care of it before she ever finds out. Just give me time. Sophie's blood turned to ice. Take care of what? Every nerve in her body screamed at her to burst out of the closet and demand answers. But she couldn't move. She could barely think. Ethan sighed heavily. Yeah, I know what's at stake. If she finds out, It'll destroy everything. Sophie clenched her fists to stop them from shaking. Her worst fears had just been confirmed. Her husband was keeping a secret from her, a dark one. She had wanted tonight to be special, to remind him of their love. But now, everything was different. Now she needed to know the truth. And she was afraid of what she might uncover. A husband's double life. Sophie felt like the air had been stolen from her lungs. The warm, romantic glow of the candlelit bedroom was still flickering, but it no longer felt inviting. Instead, it felt like a spotlight on her unraveling life. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the closet, her pulse hammering against her ribs. What had she just heard? Ethan's voice was still low, but the tension in his words was unmistakable. "I told you, I'm handling it," he muttered into the phone, his tone sharp with irritation. "But this isn't the kind of thing you rush. One wrong move, and it all collapses." Sophie's heart clenched. What wasn't the kind of thing you rushed? Her thoughts raced in a million directions, each more terrifying than the last. Had Ethan done something illegal? Was he in trouble? Or, her stomach twisted, was he having an affair? She wanted to believe it was something else. Anything else. But the signs had been there for months. The late nights, the distant looks, the guarded phone. And now, this. A bitter taste crept into her mouth. She could still picture the Ethan she had fallen in love with, the man who had once spent an entire night in the rain just to surprise her with her favorite flowers when they were first dating, the man who used to trace slow, lazy circles on her skin while whispering about their future together. That man wouldn't lie to her. That man wouldn't betray her. But now, staring through the narrow slats of the closet door, she wasn't sure she knew him at all. She forced herself to listen again. "Just keep your mouth shut," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "If she ever finds out about what happened that night, we're both screwed." Sophie nearly gasped out loud. What night? What had he done? She gripped the sleeve of one of his jackets, trying to steady herself. Think, Sophie. Had Ethan ever come home acting strange? Had there been a night where something had seemed off? And then it hit her. 3 months ago. She had woken up in the middle of the night to find Ethan slipping back into bed, his clothes slightly damp, his hair tousled. She had groggily asked him where he had been, and he had mumbled something about taking a drive to clear his head. At the time, she had accepted it. She had trusted him. But now she felt like a fool. A rustling sound snapped her back to the present. Ethan had moved across the room, pacing. "I know what's at stake," he hissed. "But I can't just make it disappear overnight. People will start asking questions." Sophie's blood ran cold. Make what disappear? A body. Evidence. She bit down on her lips so hard she tasted blood. No. Stop. Don't jump to conclusions. But how could she not? Ethan had done something. Something he was desperately trying to hide. And the worst part, he was worried that she, his own wife, would find out. Her entire body trembled. She had to get out of here. She couldn't stay hidden forever. If he caught her in the closet, listening, there would be no way to explain it. But she couldn't just pretend she hadn't heard anything either. Her mind spun through possibilities. Should she confront him? Should she act normal and investigate on her own? Or should she? Her thoughts were cut short when Ethan's tone changed. "Yeah, I love you too." Sophie's stomach dropped. Her breath came out in a shaky, uneven exhale. Ethan's voice had softened, the tension melting away in an instant. That wasn't how he talked to a friend. That wasn't how he talked to anyone, except her. Sophie's entire world cracked. There was someone else. The bitter confirmation settled in her chest, like a knife between her ribs. Her mind screamed at her to storm out of the closet, to slap the phone out of his hand, to demand to know who he had been whispering sweet lies to. But she didn't. She stayed hidden. Because now, she wasn't just dealing with a betrayal. She was dealing with a mystery. Her husband wasn't just cheating. He was hiding something much, much worse. And Sophie had every intention of finding out exactly what it was. The unraveling lies. Sophie stood frozen in the closet, her breath caught in her throat. The words, "I love you too," echoed in her mind like a cruel, taunting melody. She had suspected something was wrong. She had feared there was distance growing between them. But this... Her body trembled as her fingers clutched the fabric of Ethan's hanging shirts. He had told another woman he loved her. And worse, he was hiding something dangerous, something so big that if she found out, it would destroy everything. The man she had built a life with, the man she had once trusted more than anyone, was a stranger standing just feet away from her. I have to get out of here. But she couldn't move. Not yet. She needed to hear more. Ethan had stopped pacing. The room was silent except for the occasional soft creak of the floorboards under his weight. Sophie imagined him standing near the bed, foam still in his hand, probably rubbing the back of his neck, the way he always did when he was stressed. "Yeah," he finally muttered. "Tomorrow. I'll meet you there." Meet who? Sophie's stomach tightened. Where? A moment later, she heard the beep of the call ending. Silence. For several agonizing seconds, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Would he come into the closet? Would he open the door and find her standing there, wide-eyed and trembling, knowing everything? But then she heard him sigh. The rustle of fabric. A thud, his jacket landing on the bed. Then footsteps, heading toward the bathroom. The moment the door clicked shut and the sound of running water filled the air, Sophie moved. Her entire body screamed at her to get as far away from this room as possible. She couldn't stay here, couldn't risk him catching her. With careful, practiced movements, she pushed open the closet door just enough to slip out. The bedroom felt colder than before, as if the warmth of the candlelight had turned into something sinister, something mocking. She stepped carefully across the room, her bare feet soundless against the wooden floor. Her eyes darted toward the bathroom door, still shut, steam beginning to curl from underneath it. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she reached for his phone. It was lying face down on the nightstand. Ethan never left his phone unguarded anymore. This was her chance. Her fingers hovered over it. "Do it, Sophie." She picked it up, flipping it over. Locked. Of course. Think. Ethan was careful, but she had seen him unlock his phone enough times to guess his passcode. Hands shaking, she tried the first number that came to mind, their anniversary. Incorrect. A lump formed in her throat. He had always used that as his password before. She tried his old passcode, the one he used years ago. Incorrect. Her pulse quickened. He changed it. Before she could try another combination, the sound of the water turning off made her heart lurch. Shit. She placed the phone back exactly where she found it and backed away just as the bathroom door creaked open. Ethan stepped out, a towel slung low around his waist, steam curling around his shoulders. His dark hair was damp, drops of water trickling down his bare chest. To anyone else, he looked like the same Ethan she had always known. But Sophie knew better now. "Hey," he said, surprised to see her standing there. "I didn't hear you come in." She forced a smile. "You were on the phone. I didn't want to interrupt." His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Careful, Sophie. He's watching you." "You okay?" he asked, stepping toward her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shove him, to demand answers, to tell him she knew. But instead she nodded. "Yeah, just tired." Ethan studied her for a moment, then leaned in and kissed her forehead. It was gentle, familiar. But now, it felt like a lie. The plan. Sophie barely slept that night. Ethan had wrapped an arm around her like he always did, his breathing deep and steady. But she laid awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to every shift in his body, every small movement he made in his sleep. She couldn't stop replaying his words. If she ever finds out what happened that night, we're both screwed. What had happened? Who had he been talking to? What was he trying so hard to keep buried? By morning, Sophie had a plan. She would find out. And she knew exactly where to start. Following the trail of deception, Sophie spent the entire night in bed next to Ethan, her body rigid, her mind racing. Every breath he took, every slight movement he made, it all felt like a lie. By the time the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, she had made up her mind. She needed to know the truth. Ethan was still asleep when she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. His arm had been draped over her waist the whole night, as if he still believed everything was normal. But it wasn't. Not anymore. She tiptoed out of the bedroom and into the hallway, her breath coming fast. She didn't have much time. Last night, she had failed to unlock his phone, but that didn't mean she was out of options. Ethan was meeting someone today, someone important, and she planned to follow him. The unexpected clue. Sophie spent the morning acting normal. She made coffee like she always did, even pressing a lingering kiss to Ethan's cheek as he sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. She didn't want him to suspect anything. "So, what's your plan today?" she asked casually, setting a plate of toast in front of him. Ethan barely looked up. "Meetings, mostly." She forced a smile. "The usual?" "Yeah." He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee, but his voice lacked its usual ease. "He's lying." She felt it in her gut. And then something unexpected happened. His phone buzzed. Ethan immediately turned it face down, but not before Sophie caught a glimpse of the notification. "Unknown number. Meet me at 3 p.m. Same place." Her fingers clenched around her coffee cup. She had him. This was her chance. She forced herself to look away, to keep her expression neutral. If Ethan noticed her reaction, he didn't show it. Instead, he finished his breakfast, stood, and grabbed his keys. "I'll probably be home late," he said, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead. "I know," Sophie thought bitterly, "because I'm going to be right behind you." She watched him walk out the door. Then, without wasting a second, she grabbed her coat, her bag, and slipped out after him. The chase. Ethan's car pulled out of the driveway smoothly. Sophie waited a beat before she followed in her own car, keeping a safe distance. Her heart pounded as she maneuvered through the city, following him. He had always been a careful driver, steady, predictable. But today, he was checking his mirrors. He was being extra careful. It took everything in Sophie not to panic. Does he know I'm following him? No, he couldn't. She kept her grip tight on the wheel, focusing on the road. The minutes dragged on as she followed him through streets she barely recognized. Then, at exactly 3 p.m., he pulled into a parking lot. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. A hotel. Not a restaurant. Not a cafe. Not an office building. A hotel. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled into a spot near the back, keeping her head low as she watched Ethan step out of his car. He wasn't alone for long. A woman approached him. Tall, dark hair, a long coat that billowed in the wind. Sophie's stomach twisted. Ethan reached out and touched the woman's arm, intimately. Then, without hesitation, they disappeared into the hotel lobby. Sophie's world crashed. The confrontation that almost happened. For a split second, she considered storming inside, demanding answers, throwing her marriage in his face, screaming. But she didn't, because something still didn't add up. If this was just an affair, why the secrecy? Why the phone call about something dangerous? Why the fear in his voice last night? No. There was more to this. Sophie forced herself to wait, to think. After nearly 45 minutes, Ethan and the woman emerged from the hotel. Sophie clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palm. Ethan glanced around before leaning in close to the woman. Their conversation was brief, but then he handed her something. A small black envelope. The woman took it, nodded, then walked away, disappearing into the busy street. Ethan stood there for a long moment, running a hand through his hair before finally heading back to his car. Sophie's entire body buzzed. What was in that envelope? Money. Documents. A secret he never wanted her to see. One thing was clear. This was way bigger than an affair. And she wasn't stopping until she uncovered everything. The web of secrets. Sophie sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. A hotel. A woman. A black envelope. Everything she had just witnessed sent chills through her veins. She should have felt anger, fury, heartbreak. But all she felt was confusion. If this were just an affair, why had Ethan looked so tense? Why the whispered phone call? Why the urgency? This was something bigger, something Ethan never wanted her to know. And she was going to find out. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Ethan's car had already disappeared down the street, but the mysterious woman had walked off in the opposite direction. Sophie made a decision. She was going to follow her. The woman in the coat. Sophie climbed out of her car, moving quickly but carefully. The woman was just a few paces ahead, her long coat swaying as she weaved through the crowded sidewalks. Sophie kept her distance, blending into the flow of people. She had no idea who this woman was, but the way Ethan had spoken to her, the secrecy, the black envelope, it all pointed to something more than infidelity. They walked for blocks. The woman didn't seem to notice she was being followed. Finally, she turned onto a quieter street and ducked into a small cafe. Sophie hesitated outside, heart pounding. She peered through the window. The woman had taken a seat near the back, pulling the black envelope from her pocket. Then she did something Sophie hadn't expected. She didn't open it. Instead, she took out her phone and made a call. Sophie's stomach churned. Who was she calling? Pressing her back against the wall outside, she wished she could hear the conversation. Seconds later, the woman stood up abruptly, shoved the envelope back into her coat, and left. Sophie barely had time to react before she was moving again, her pulse hammering. Who was this woman? And why did Sophie have the sinking feeling that she was dangerous? An unexpected discovery. Sophie followed her for another 15 minutes, watching as she entered a nondescript building with tinted windows and no signage. Something about it made the hairs on Sophie's arms stand up. She hesitated. Should she go inside? Was she pushing too far? But then, a flash of movement caught her eye. The black envelope. The woman had passed it off to a man in a dark suit. Sophie's stomach dropped. Who the hell was Ethan involved with? Something was very, very wrong. Sophie reached into her bag, gripping her phone with trembling fingers. She quickly snapped a photo of the building, the suited man, the woman. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she turned and walked away. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. The locked drawer. When Sophie got home, she found the house empty. Ethan wouldn't be back for hours. This was her chance. She stormed into the bedroom and went straight to his office. There was one place she had never searched before. The locked drawer in his desk. For years, Ethan had brushed off her curiosity. It's just work stuff, he'd say with a casual shrug. Nothing important. But now, Sophie knew better. She yanked open the other drawers, rummaging through papers and files. Nothing. Then her eyes landed on his watchbox. Ethan had an expensive collection, each watch stored neatly in its velvet-lined case. And yet, one of them felt too light. Heart racing. She picked it up. Something rattled inside. She turned it over, and her breath caught. A tiny key had been taped to the back. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free. Then, without wasting another second, she jammed it into the locked drawer. Click. The drawer slid open. Inside, she found another black envelope. Her throat tightened. It was identical to the one she had seen Ethan give that woman. Sophie reached in, her fingers brushing against the cold paper. She pulled it out, flipped it over, and saw Ethan's handwriting. Her hand shook as she opened it. Then she read the first line, and everything changed. The shocking truth. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. The letter was short, precise, but every word felt like a gunshot. Transfer completed. Keep this quiet. No one can find out what happened that night. If the money isn't there by next week, you know what's at stake. Destroy this letter after reading. Sophie's vision blurred. She gripped the desk for support, her mind racing. Ethan was involved in something illegal. Money. Secrecy. Something that happened that night. A chill crawled up her spine. What had her husband done? Just then, the front door slammed. Sophie's breath hitched. Ethan was home. She had seconds to hide the letter. She stuffed it back into the drawer, locked it, and shoved the key into her pocket just as Ethan's footsteps echoed down the hall. Her heart pounded wildly. Then the office door swung open. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. And for the first time in their entire marriage, Sophie was terrified of her own husband. The truth no one was meant to know. Sophie barely had time to steady her breathing before Ethan stepped inside the office. His expression was unreadable. Something about the way he stood, rigid, his fingers twitching slightly, set off alarm bells in her mind. Did he know? Did he suspect she had found the letter? She forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat. "Hey," she said, trying to sound normal. "You're home early." Ethan's eyes flicked around the room as if scanning for something. "I had a feeling you'd be in here," he said slowly. "Looking for something." Her pulse spiked. She had to stay calm. "Lie." She let out a soft chuckle. "Actually, I was looking for a pen. My shopping list is a mess." Ethan didn't move. His gaze lingered on the desk. Then he smiled. But it wasn't his usual smile. It was calculated. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. Sophie's palms were slick with sweat, but she nodded casually. "Yeah, I did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension. Then Ethan took a step forward, and Sophie stepped back. That was when she saw it, the slightest change in his expression, a flicker of realization, a silent confirmation that she knew. Her stomach twisted. She needed to get out of there. "The clock is ticking. I should start dinner," she said quickly, moving toward the door. But before she could pass him, Ethan reached out and gently caught her wrist. Sophie's breath hitched. His grip wasn't hard. It wasn't forceful. But it was enough. "Sit down, Sophie," he murmured. "Let's talk." She felt a sharp chill spread through her body. He knew. He absolutely knew. A million thoughts raced through her mind. If she refused, would he get angry? If she ran, would he stop her? Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She forced a smile. Sure," she said, keeping her voice light. She slowly sat down in the chair beside the desk, her mind scrambling for a plan. Ethan leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "So," he said smoothly, "what were you really doing in here?" Sophie forced a laugh. "I already told you." "No," Ethan interrupted. His voice was calm. Too calm. His eyes darkened. "You were looking for something." A chill ran down Sophie's spine. She needed to choose her words carefully. She shook her head, feigning confusion. "Ethan, what's going on? You're acting really weird." Ethan didn't blink. Then, slowly, he pulled something from his pocket, and Sophie's stomach dropped. It was the black envelope. The same one she had just put back in the drawer. Her body went numb. How? How did he have it? She had locked the drawer. She had put the key in her pocket. Had he known all along? Had he been watching her? Ethan tilted his head, watching her reaction. "You should be more careful," he said softly. "You left fingerprints." Sophie's blood ran cold. He was testing her, waiting for her to crack. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay still. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan chuckled. "Come on, Sophie." He slowly opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. Then he began to read. Transfer completed. Keep this quiet. No one can find out what happened that night. His eyes flicked up to hers, and Sophie realized he wasn't angry. He was amused. That scared her even more. A dangerous confession. Sophie's fingers curled into fists on her lap. She could feel her pulse in her throat. What does it mean? She asked quietly. What night? Ethan sighed, shaking his head. Sophie, do you really want to know? She swallowed hard. Yes. For a moment, he just studied her. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he folded the letter and put it back into his pocket. His voice was soft when he finally spoke. There are things you can't take back, he said. Decisions. Mistakes. Sophie's breath quickened. Ethan, what did you do? He didn't answer right away. Then, you remember my promotion, the one that changed everything for us? Sophie frowned. Of course. Ethan gave a slow nod. I didn't get it because of my hard work. Sophie's stomach twisted. What do you mean? Ethan's gaze didn't waver. There was a man standing in my way, he said simply. And now he's not. Sophie felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She stared at him, trying to process his words. What? What are you saying? She whispered. Ethan sighed. I think you already know. A wave of nausea hit her. No, this couldn't be real. This was her husband, the man she had built a life with, the man she thought she knew. But now, as she looked into his eyes, she realized. She had no idea who he really was. Her hands trembled. Ethan, tell me you're lying. Silence. The kind of silence that confirmed everything. Sophie's vision blurred. She thought about the black envelope, the secret meeting, the money. And suddenly, it all made sense. Her husband had done something terrible. And now, she was part of it. Nowhere to run. Sophie's entire body screamed at her to run, to get out. But she couldn't move. Ethan watched her, waiting, like a hunter watching prey. She tried to steady her breathing. She needed to think. She needed a way out. Finally, she forced herself to speak. Ethan, she said, carefully keeping her voice steady. I won't tell anyone. He didn't move. I mean it, she added, her hands tightening around the arms of the chair. I love you. We'll figure this out. A slow smile spread across his face. Sophie, he murmured, you're a terrible liar. And then, his phone rang. Ethan's expression darkened as he glanced at the screen. That was her chance. The moment he turned away, she ran. Sophie bolted out of the office, her heart hammering. She sprinted down the hall, toward the front door. But just as she reached it, a hand grabbed her wrist. She gasped. Ethan's grip was strong. His voice was low, steady. You're not leaving, Sophie. Terror shot through her. She struggled, twisting against his hold. Let me go, Ethan. His jaw tightened. You shouldn't have gone through my things. Her chest heaved. Please. Ethan exhaled sharply. Then he leaned in and whispered, It's too late for that. And with one swift motion, everything went dark. The escape that changed everything. Darkness. A crushing, suffocating void. Sophie could hear her own breathing. Harsh, erratic, shallow. Her head throbbed. Something warm trickled down her temple. Blood. Then she felt it. The cold metal around her wrist. Handcuffs. A surge of panic slammed into her chest. She tried to move, but her limbs were weak. Disoriented. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was Ethan's voice. It's too late for that. And then, nothing. The cage of lies. Sophie blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the dim light. She was in a room. Not their bedroom. Not the office. Somewhere unfamiliar. The air smelled damp, stale. She turned her head slightly. A chair. A table. A small window, too high to reach. Her heart pounded. This wasn't a nightmare. It was real. Footsteps. Her stomach clenched. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside. Calm. Collected. Like this was normal. Like he hadn't just knocked her unconscious and locked her away. "Sophie," he said smoothly, "you're awake." She glared at him. "What the hell is this?" Ethan sighed, stepping closer. "I didn't want it to come to this." Her pulse hammered. "Let me go." Ethan crouched beside her, his blue eyes locked onto hers. "I can't do that," he said softly. "Not yet." Sophie's stomach dropped. "Not yet." Revealing the past, she clenched her fists. "Ethan, you're scaring me." He exhaled sharply. "I know, and I hate that." He reached out. She flinched. A flicker of something crossed his face. Then, he sighed. "This isn't what I wanted, Sophie." She swallowed hard. "Then let me go." Silence. Ethan stared at her. And then, he spoke. "You want the truth." Her heart pounded. "Yes." His jaw clenched. "All right." He leaned back against the wall, running a hand through his hair. 3 years ago, he started. "I made a choice." Sophie's hands trembled. "I had a boss. Landon Pierce. He was ruthless. Powerful. He controlled everything." Her throat went dry. "I worked under him for years, Sophie. But one day, I found something I wasn't supposed to find." Sophie's breath hitched. "What?" Ethan's eyes darkened. Evidence of things he'd done. Illegal things. Her chest tightened. "And," Ethan exhaled, "and I made a deal." Sophie's stomach twisted. "A deal?" Ethan nodded. "I gave the evidence to someone who wanted him gone. Someone dangerous." Her mind spun. "Landon disappeared," Ethan continued. "No one ever found his body." She froze. "Oh, God." "Ethan," she whispered. "Did you?" His eyes locked onto hers. "I didn't kill him," he said. "But I might as well have." The room felt smaller, tighter, the air thicker. Sophie struggled against the cuffs. "You're telling me this now? After everything?" Ethan's jaw tensed. "Because now you know too much." Her stomach dropped. No way out. Sophie's breath quickened. She needed to think. Fast. I won't say anything," she said quickly. "I swear." Ethan sighed. "I want to believe that." He stood up, pacing. "But you're my wife. And now you know about the money. The letter. The transfer." Her chest burned. The money. The $500,000 transfer. It wasn't a bribe. It was hush money. Oh, God. The realization hit her like a train. She had married a man who had buried a secret so dark it could ruin them both. And now she was part of it. Tears burned in her eyes. "Ethan, please." Ethan exhaled. Then he crouched beside her again. And for the first time, she saw it. A flicker of guilt. Regret. "I love you, Sophie," he murmured. Her chest ached. "But I can't let you leave." She snapped. She kicked him. Hard. Ethan cursed, stumbling back. That was her chance. Sophie lunged forward, twisting, yanking, pulling. The chair tipped. She hit the ground hard, but pain didn't matter. All that mattered was getting free. She twisted her wrists, scraping her skin raw. And then, the cuffs snapped open. Her breath caught. Ethan's eyes widened. And in that moment, she ran. The chase. Sophie sprinted. Down the hall, through the doorway. Her feet pounded against the floor. Behind her, Ethan's footsteps. Sophie. She didn't stop. She reached the front door. Unlocked it. Yanked it open. A hand grabbed her arm. "No." She struggled, kicking, thrashing. Ethan's grip tightened. "You're not thinking, Sophie," he hissed. "You can't run from this." Tears streamed down her face. "I don't even know who you are anymore." His face twisted. "I'm still your husband." "No," she choked. "You're a liar." She drove her knee into his ribs. He gasped. And she broke free. She ran into the night. Freedom or a trap? Her lungs burned. Her heart raced. But she didn't stop. She ran until the house was nothing but a dark silhouette, until the trees swallowed her whole, until her legs collapsed beneath her. Tears blurred her vision. She was free. But now, what did she do? She had two choices: call the police and expose everything. Disappear. Because if Ethan had done this to her, who else was he capable of silencing? She pulled out her phone. Her fingers shook. Then, she dialed. And when the voice answered, she took a deep breath. "I need help."